I'm going to show you how to take your basic, either your bodice sloper that you have, or if you have a pattern that has a rounded neckline or a boat neckline. This pattern here shows a boat with a bit of a slit in the front. It's got a few different variations. Here's another regular blouse pattern. You may have this in your pattern collection with a round neck. I'm going to show you how to turn this type of a neckline either on a dress or a blouse into a V-neck or a round neck or a boat neck, as the pattern, this pattern actually has. I'm going to be working with this actual pattern pieces from this. So I'm going to show you how to adapt this in case you can't get it to a store. You've got the fit of this nice and you're happy with it. You just don't like the neckline. You want to change the neckline up. So I'm going to show you how to do a few different necklines, including a sweetheart neckline. So you can either start with your your manila slopers if you have them. If you don't, you can take a pattern. So I've taken this one. I've actually done some of the sample necklines, which I'm going to show you how to get to your bust circle and how to do the different necklines here. So you can actually take a pattern that you already have, that you're happy with, and adapt it and change the neckline. Okay, we're at the mannequin and we're going to determine the radius of your bust circle. So what I've done is I've actually just taken a circle here and marked the center or the apex of my bust on my mannequin. So I'm going to take my tape measure to the center of that, and I'm going to measure down. Now you could do this on your body or just on your muslin when you've got your muslin on. So I'm determining where the bottom of my breast is, where it actually goes and connects to your body. So that gives you the radius of your bust circle. So you're going to determine that either on your mannequin, or you can do it on yourself and record that measurement for your adjustments. So for this pattern, I'm going to assume that this is, I haven't done any changes to it. So if this pattern is done to industry standards, it's going to be for a B cup. So a B cup usually has a radius of about 2.5 to 3 inches. Okay, 3 inches probably being more accurate. A C would have 3.5, a D 4, an A 2 to 2.5. So you can kind of see that it changes by cup size in about ½ inch intervals. So what I'm going to do is take a look at your rulers. You can either make yourself a little compass type template, or if you have a ruler like this, whether it's a quilting ruler, it might have, I've got little holes in this at every ½ inch. So I know that my radius has to be 3 inches. So I'm going to take, and I've got at the 0 point, I've got my my ruler there. If you've got an awl, or I found a sharp pair of scissors. So I'm going to go over 3 inches, and on the middle I can see this 3-inch mark, and I'm just going to draw a circle and move that one out of the way. So keep this, may have to, okay, so now you can see that I have this circle around my bust apex. So you just want to make sure that this area is, if this is what you want to keep covered, you don't want to have your neckline go within this circle, or that you will, if you've got a V-neck and you come within this circle, that you're going to have some of the swell of your breast at the top, or cleavage or something, depending on the size of you. The larger the cup size, the bigger this circle is going to be. So this is something you can easily put on any pattern you have, whether it's a commercial pattern or your sloper. So now what I've done with this pattern is I can tell that it's a very wide neck, okay? So it's going to sit closer to my shoulder. So what I want to do then is I want to extend my shoulder. So I've actually gone from the side, this was a size 12, so I've taken off the 5-inch seam allowance with this red line here. So I've actually extended this shoulder about 1.5 inches into my neckline to bring it closer to the actual neck of my curve of my neckline, which would be very close to, if you took you see how when I take my sloper here, this is actually the shoulder length. So you would want to go from your shoulder point over to wherever your neckline is on your body, and draw that line if you want to have a narrower opening. Okay, so I've got my neckline extended. So if I want to do this as, say I want to do this as a V-neck, I'm going to determine how far down. Here's my bust point here. So I'm going to decide how far down. Do I want to go down into, lower into my bust circle? I'm not actually going to be in my bust circle, but I'm going to say I want to make my bust line go down this far. So now I've actually got a straight ruler, and I think I definitely curve this, so I'm going to actually move over here and here's a curved ruler. So you're just going to experiment with this line, okay? You can make it whatever it is you want to do. So you see now I've gone from a wide, more of a boat neck here, down to drawing a V-neck. So you just have to remember that you have a back and a front. You've changed the neckline, so you have to do the same thing on the back. You have to extend your shoulder over as far. Now this one said that it has, and read your pattern, because your commercial patterns will have a lot of information on them. This one says that it's 1.5 inches lower than the normal neckline. So I brought this up 1.5 inches. So now I could make let's see if I can do that one, this one here. I can make my back neckline still have a bit of a curve. So you see how it's a lot straighter now, my back neckline, but I've got it extended so it would match. My shoulder seams are going to match up with the front. So there's how to do it and turn it into a V-neck. I'm going to change colors here, and I'm going to give you show you how to change it into a sweetheart neck. So now a sweetheart neck can actually it can start close to the collarbone up here, or it could actually start farther over and be a little wider. And I think for this little demonstration, I'm actually going to bring it back to the width that this pattern was actually brought at. So one thing you want to remember with your sweetheart is you want the curve of the heart, like the sweetheart part, to kind of be similar to the curve of your bust circle. So I'm going to take and I'm going to come down, and again, this is a personal preference as to how far down you want to go. So I'm going to stick with how low I have it. So you see here I've got my sweetheart neckline. Now as far as the back of this pattern goes, I could leave this back to the exact pattern that the original was. I wouldn't have to actually change the back. Okay, so now what you want to remember, you want to make sure that when you do your facings, that they all follow the same. And what you have to also remember, whether it's your V or your sweetheart, or even if it's a circle, this seam here is now, if you cut it out, you're going to have to put a stay stitch or stabilize it pretty well right after you get it cut so it doesn't stretch, because you can see there's curves, there's angles. This is going to end up being with a bit of bias from your fabric. So you want to make sure that you don't stretch it out. That's where you get into fitting problems, where your dress or your top, your neckline is going to kind of bow out a little bit or flop out. It's not going to sit nicely to the contour of your body. So when you do your facings, make sure your facings follow here. Make sure when you cut your pattern out, and I'll get into that in the next step, that you either have your you don't cut your facing or your interfacing off of something cut. You always cut it from your actual pattern piece, so that you're not you haven't, if you've cut it out of fabric and you've possibly picked it up and moved it, you may have stretched and distorted this seam just a little bit, but it may be enough that when you sew your pieces together, you sew your facing or your lining, whatever the case that it is, to the outer dress, that you've maybe stretched one of them a little bit, and so your neckline is not going to sit comfortably and close to the body. You want this neckline to sort of sit right along your body, so that it's not sitting outside of your body. There's not a gap in here or here. So V-neck is in the red line and sweetheart neck in the blue. This is a boat neck because of the width of it. If I wanted to change this neckline to not be a boat neck, I could actually take, so you see now I can bring my shoulder over, so now I've got more of a jewel neck. If you look at your sloper, it's going to be very close to the sloper. Now this is a different size, so they don't fit. So just make sure that you like the look of your line, and cut it out. Even if you cut it out on just a fold of fabric that you can, just a muslin or something that you can lay against your mannequin or lay against yourself. Make sure that you like the look of where this is, that this now has to have a seam allowance put on it. There's no seam allowance. This is actually the sewing lines that I've gone by. So bust circle, important thing to kind of keep in mind when you're changing your neckline, so that you give yourself either the flattering look that you want, or you don't start exposing too much, because once you've cut this down quite low, you can't add the fabric back on. But if you cut it up a little higher, you can take a little bit of the fabric away. Okay, so I've taken my pattern and I've cut it out. I've got my front here. I've done the sweetheart neckline. So I haven't done my stay stitching on here, but I'm going to do that in the next step. So I'm going to stay stitch at about 1/2 inch all the way along this neckline. But I wanted to sort of show you how, if you see how I can actually stretch this area here, if this isn't stay stitched, this sweetheart curve actually curves outwards. So these are all things that we want to make sure that when we get our interfacing and our facings in, and our pieces stitched to the front and back to the facings, that we avoid this problem. So we want to fix this and stabilize this whole area. So I actually made a pattern piece for my facing. So this is my facing pattern piece, traced it right off of the actual pattern here. So you can see here is my actual pattern that I was showing you earlier. I've got my sweetheart neck. I did put 5/8 of an inch seam allowance along the curve here. So I just folded my paper in half and literally traced around. You want to keep a nice smooth curve on this lower edge instead of having it pointed. It's just, if it happens to show through when pressed or whatever, you don't want to point. It's a little more invisible if you can kind of keep that a nice curved edge. Other than that, this is all the same right down. I actually did my neck and arm facings, and I'll show you how to sew that together instead of doing two separate pieces, instead of having an armhole facing and a neck facing. Now this could very well be a blouse or something you're putting a sleeve in. If that's the case, you wouldn't need this facing in here at all. You could actually take and draw this up here. You could actually have your facing kind of come up into your armhole. You could even make it just narrower so that you don't have all of this extra bulk if you don't need it. I've done the same for my back. So here's my back facing. Made sure that I have my grain line. There is a center back seam here, so I've left that, but the same thing. My neckline and my armhole, same curved part for my facing, okay? And I've cut my interfacing out. So I cut out my facing pieces. So I've cut out my facing out of my fabric, and I've cut my interfacing out. Now I used my pattern pieces for both of these. I did not open this up and then lay my pattern or my interfacing down over top. I went right back to my pattern because I know that this matches my neckline, and it hasn't, for whatever reason, been pulled out, just in case this has gotten pulled out of and is a little bit distorted. You always want to make sure that your facings are true to the actual pattern and not necessarily the pattern piece, in case you've changed anything during when you've cut or pulled it. Maybe you've tried it on just to check the fit. That could distort the neckline or something as well. So I've got these. I've actually fused the interfacing to the back. So I'm now going to fuse my front, and then I'm going to take and I'm going to do all of my stay stitching on this edge. So I'll probably do it at a 1/2 inch at about a 2.5 stitch length, pivoting when I come to each of the corners here and going back up the sides. On my back, I'm also going to take this upper neckline here, and I'm going to do a stay stitching on this as well. Now, because this is a sweetheart neckline, I am going to probably add some twill tape in here after I sew, just to keep this little area a little bit more stabilized and help it to hug close to the body. Okay, so I've done my stay stitching here. You can see how I've stitched down along this on the sweetheart neckline. It might be a little bit more visible on the wrong side with the contrast thread. So now I'm ready to start the process of sewing my facing and my neckline together. Okay, so I have sewn around my facing. Now this is my front and my front facing. So I haven't sewn my shoulders together. That'll be the next step. But I've sewn from the top edge of my inside neckline all the way around to the other side, pivoting where needed. On my armholes, I've sewn my armhole. The only difference is I've started about 2 inches, 1.5 to 2 inches down, leaving this open. That will be what I need for sewing the arm or the shoulder seam up. So I'm going to do the exact same on the back. Each piece I'm going to sew the neckline, and I'm going to sew the armhole, leaving an opening. I am going to put some twill tape in this because I like, when I have a sweetheart neck, to have an extra reinforcement here. It helps the neckline hug to your body. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew, I want my stitches to stay on this 5/8 of an inch seam. I'm going to take my twill tape. I'm not going to pull it all the way around this neckline. I'm just going to do the actual sweetheart part. So I'm laying my twill tape just over the 5/8 line. So I'm going to have about a 1/16 of an inch, not in my seam allowance, but hanging into my actual dress. So I'm going to start right on the corner at 5/8 of an inch, back stitch. So I'm just going to take my twill tape, and you don't want it to stretch out. You don't want to gather it too much, but you do want to kind of hold it nice and taut. So this is tricky because you've got to watch your seam allowance to make sure your seam allowance stays on the 5/8. You've got to watch your twill tape to make sure that you're only stitching with an even amount of twill tape over the original seam allowance, and keeping things, not keeping your twill tape loose. You want to hold it taut. So I'm going to try to stitch right down to my point, pivot point here. So I'm going to get down to the point. And if you run short, you can always shorten your stitches. So leaving my needle down, I'm just going to hold this back. So I am off a little, so I'm either going to have a bit of my seam allowance showing, or I'm going to have taken my seam allowance in by roughly a 1/16. But you can see here where my twill tape, there's about an 1/8. I've kind of gone almost down the middle of this 1/4 inch twill tape. So I've got about an 1/8. As long as it's even on all the way around, it's not as critical. So now I'm just pivoting to go up the other side. So I didn't cut the twill tape or anything. I'm just turning and I'm going up the other side, following the same, keeping my twill tape. So I've got one eye watching my twill tape and my other eye, or just going back and forth watching my seam allowance guide. So I'm just going to come to the edge, and you want to stop right on that 5/8 where you would have gone and stitched back up. So now you can see how I've got my twill tape sewn in here and on the back. So I am a little off here. So I would probably go back and restitch that, because if I'm not the same on both sides, I'm going to have one of my sides of my sweetheart is not going to be the same. So I actually would go back in. I'm going to take, actually I'll show you what I'm going to do just so you've got a visual of it. So I'm just going to pick this out, hopefully just catch the stitch and not. So I'm just going to pick out till I sort of see where on the other side here. So back a little bit farther. So now I can take it back to the machine and put my needle down and just kind of make sure that I keep my twill tape. I'm kind of pulling it up now so I can see underneath here. And I'm going to get to that point. And I'm just going to go around and overlap my stitch maybe 3 times. All right, let's see if I did a little bit better this time. Oh yeah. So now I'm pretty well right on. So now I'm going to take this, I'm going to clip and grade my seams, clip down. I'll show you the resulting clips, and then we will sew the shoulders together. Okay, so I've got my back done. I've done a little bit of understitching, and I will show you how to do a little bit of that after I do the shoulder here. So understitching is just sort of to help keep your fabric all pulled to the facing side so that when you iron it and turn it, it's not showing on the outside. So I'm going to do my one shoulder here. So I've got the back. So here's my neckline. Here's my armhole that's opened. Here is my front of my dress, same thing, my armhole. So I'm lining up the shoulder. You've got to try to open this up. It's a little trickier. Actually, it helps if you put right sides together. So I'm going to put right sides together. And you want to take and put a pin in where your actual shoulder seam is. I don't know if you can see this seam here, but I want to get a pin in here so that when I stitch this, that this lines up perfectly. So I'm just going to get a pin in. So I've got a pin in there. So you can start, and so you aren't going to be able to do a lot of pinning simply because unless you've left this seam open really wide, which 1.5 inches is fine for this neckline, but you might, if it was a really narrow shoulder, you might have to open it 2 or 2.5 even. So I'm going to stitch across my 5/8 here, and I'm going to stitch across. I'm going to start from the actual fabric, the armhole side. So I'm going to stitch across here till I get to where the shoulder, the facing, and the dress join. This will be clear once you see it put together. So line up right sides together, 5/8 of an inch. I'm going to stitch, keeping everything flat in the behind. And I just have to kind of pull things, tuck things out of the way. Another reason why you want to keep your needle down if you can. If you don't have that option, just make sure that you sort of stop and put your needle down. So I'm going to get to where my facing and my dress meet at the shoulder. Pulled the pin out, got my needle down. I'm going to lift my presser foot out and just kind of pull everything so that I make sure I don't have anything tucked behind. And I'm going to continue sewing across the facing and all the way to the end, back stitch. So snip your threads. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this, actually I've got to pull it from this side. So you're actually turning, I got to turn this right side out. So I'm going to pull this all so it's right side out. So another reason you don't sew the side seams up till after you get all of your shoulder facing. So now you can see that, let's see if I can get it to show you. So there's my one side, there's my shoulder seam right there. There's my side, there's my sweetheart neckline. So I'm going to give all of this a press. I'm going to do some understitching on the facing side, catching all the twill tape, catching all the seam allowances on the facing side. I'm going to actually pull this side through, and then I'm going to sew the other back in. It'll just be a little bit easier to stitch across that shoulder when everything is flipped right side out. So I'm going to do the other shoulder, and then I'm going to show you a little bit of understitching. Okay, so before I stitch my other shoulder seam, I'm just going to show you some understitching. So I've pushed all of my fabric on the wrong side, all towards the facing. So I've already trimmed and clipped this seam. So now I'm just going to run my row of understitching, which is about 1/8 of an inch away from the actual seam, and it's done on the facing side, so it doesn't show from the right side of the fabric or the right side of the garment. So you have to just kind of keep your fingers back. If you know, now you could have pressed it and got everything pressed to the right side. That definitely would make it a lot easier. So because I've turned this right side out, it's much easier to get the facing or the understitching all the way up to the top of my seam allowance. So I'm just going to give that a so you can see from the right side, there's my understitching right there. Okay, so now I would do the same. I will do the same actually on the armhole, but I usually wait till after I've got all the shoulder seams done. So now you just want to take, we have one shoulder together over here. So now I'm going to take this other shoulder and the same thing. So right sides together, lining up the facing. So I'm going to pin in here, and I'm going to stitch, line up this whole seam across the top here, start stitching at the armhole side at 5/8. Just make sure you haven't caught anything extra that you don't want to catch. And when you need to, just lift up, press your foot, make sure your needle's in the down position, and just shift everything, lining up the rest of the seam across the shoulder. And continue stitching, keeping it flat. So now I can just pull that through, and so there is my other side done. Now you see I have an opening here. That's the gap that we left open. So what I have to do now is I actually have to pull from the inside. So you're going to pull not everything right side or wrong side out, but just enough that you can actually close that seam. So you can just pull a little bit back, and you will see that you can just see which side you've pressed your seam allowance for the shoulder seam to, and make sure that you do the same here. So when I trimmed, I left the 5/8 of an inch seam along this edge here so that I could still stitch it. So you just want to make sure you've pulled enough out. Start wherever you've stopped at the top or left the opening. You don't need to back stitch as long as you're going over a couple of stitches. So make sure your seam allowances are all pressed in the right direction, and you're going to stitch across this here. And take a look on both sides, make sure you haven't caught it anywhere. And if everything looks okay, you can pull it out and just double check before you trim. Otherwise, just trim away the excess in your seam allowance. And you may need to clip a little bit, so clip down. Then you can pull this out, and you see you have, there's your shoulder seam all done. So this is the armhole seam now. So I'm going to make sure that I've finished off my darts, any other things I have to do. If I'm putting a zipper in the back, if I haven't already done that, I'm going to put my zipper in. I think for this one, I'm actually going to baste up the back seam and try it on after I've pressed it all out. If I don't need a seam, a zipper down the back, I'm not going to put one in. I'm just going to have a back seam. This fabric has a little bit of stretch to it, so it just may stretch over. I may have given myself enough of an opening to get my head through without having to put a zipper down the back. One less thing to do.